back to the deep dive. Today we are diving deep into, well, maybe the biggest mystery of all. You.
Or rather, what happens when you seem to disappear?
Exactly. That profound, sometimes really uncanny experience of losing your sense of self. What gets called ego dissolution across a lot of different fields.
Yeah, you hear about it everywhere, don't you? Deep meditation, psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, certain kinds of trauma too.
And what we're exploring today is, I think, a pretty radical shift in how we look at this.
We're really trying to treat the self not as, some fixed, untouchable soul or entity.
Right.
But more as a dynamic, measurable, and actually surprisingly fragile construct.
That's the mission for this deep dive. We've pulled together sources from philosophy, cognitive science, cutting-edge neuroimaging, to really define what the self is, structurally speaking, and crucially, what's happening in the brain when it undergoes this thing our research calls the unlooping.
We're digging into the science behind these recursive structures that seem to build and maintain our identity. The core idea here, that continuous, seemingly solid experience of being you.
Yeah.
It's actually an incredibly complicated, high-speed kind of neural juggling act. Not as solid as it feels.
Okay, let's unpack that, starting with the philosophy side. Specifically, Thomas Metzinger's self-model theory of subjectivity. And I have to say, the claim is pretty radical, maybe a bit unsettling.
It really is. The radical insight is basically that the self isn't a soul, it's not a core being, it's more like the brain's most sophisticated high-speed user interface.
A user interface?
Yeah. Metzinger argues that what we experience as us, the phenomenal self, isn't a thing at all. It's an ongoing process.
Okay.
It's the content of a transparent, constantly generated self-model. It's an illusion, yes, but it's so fundamental that your brain is basically committed to running it 24/7.
Wait, okay, if it's just a feedback loop or a process, why does it feel so permanent, so unified? Why doesn't it just, flicker or crash all the time?
That's the really clever part.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that idea of recursion. The self-model is recursive in its structure.
Recursive, meaning
Meaning it loops back on itself. Think of it like a really advanced surveillance system. It doesn't just monitor the street outside and the building itself that's like your body and the environment.
Right.
It also constantly monitors its own monitoring process.
So it's modeling the model itself. That creates a layer of self-awareness.
Exactly. That layering, that modeling of the model, that's what generates those essential feelings we have of agency, continuity, being the same person over time.
Okay.
And because it's described as a structural, dynamically enacted achievement, well, that highlights how plastic it is, how fragile even.
So your self isn't like a solid statue. It's this constant, maybe even exhausting juggling act.
Pretty much. A very convincing one most of the time.
Okay, so if the self is built on these nested models, these loops feeding back,
Yeah.
then ego dissolution is literally the unlooping.
That's the idea. The moment the system stops monitoring its own monitoring, or that loop gets disrupted.
That makes sense as a framework for all these different experiences, then.
Right. It's the breakdown of those recursive feedback loops. The ones responsible for your sense of agency, your feeling of being located here, the boundary between you and the world.
And when that collapses, it's like an existential suspension. The structures that orient your whole experience just pause.
Yeah, that sense of where you end and the world begins can just momentarily vanish.
And to make it even more slippery, some sources suggest this feeling of a unified, static self is maybe just an illusion created by sheer speed.
This is the dynamic model concept. It suggests the self arises from this incredibly rapid back and forth switch.
Switching between what?
Between simple awareness, just, experiencing the world, seeing red, hearing a sound, an awareness of awareness, that metacognitive layer, the knowing that you are aware.
So it's not simultaneous.
Apparently not. The idea is this alternation is so fast, so constant, that we perceive it as one smooth, unified experience, like frames in a movie.
Even though it's structurally two different modes flickering back and forth.
Exactly. So you're not really a stable self, you're more like a rapid flicker of self.
Wow, okay, that is a dense conceptual picture. But this is where it gets really fascinating for me. Moving from the philosophical what to the neurobiological how.
Right, connecting the theory to the brain.
If this self-model breaks down, this unlooping happens, what exactly are we seeing in the brain? Is there a specific neural signature across these different states? Meditation, psychedelics?
Well, the sources are pointing quite clearly now towards specific findings, particularly around frequency-specific brain activity.
Okay.
The key neurophysiological finding, and this seems pretty robust from recent imaging studies, links the suspension of the embodied self. You know, the dissolving of that feeling of being a localized I inside your head.
Yeah.
It links that to significant reductions in beta band activity, beta waves.
Beta waves. That's usually linked to being alert, active, thinking, right? Focused attention.
Precisely. And this reduction, this quieting of beta waves, seems to be happening primarily in a specific brain region, the posterior medial cortex, or PMC.
PMC rings a bell. That's a major hub of the default mode network, isn't it?
Exactly right. The DMN, the system everyone agrees is crucial for self-related thinking, autobiographical memory, mind wandering, that kind of stuff.
So when the self starts to dissolve, the main hub for self-processing goes relatively quiet, specifically in that beta frequency range.
That seems to be the pattern.
So are we looking at a potentially shared neurological mechanism here, regardless of whether you got there through, say, 10 years of meditation practice or a dose of DMT?
It certainly looks that way. The studies on psychedelics like 5-MeO-DMT show similar dramatic drops in posterior beta power.
And crucially,
The amount of decrease correlates directly with people's subjective reports of bodily self-disruption, how much their sense of physical self dissolved.
okay, that's a strong link.
Yet the inference is that reduced beta power suggests a brain state where those top-down predictive models, the ones constantly working overtime to generate and maintain the feeling of you, are inhibited or dampened.
They're just not running as strongly. And we even see this effect pop up when people deliberately practice things like third-person perspective meditation, where they try to view themselves from the outside.
That's right. Even that kind of mental practice, which deliberately plays with the minimal self and the body boundary, is associated with similar beta band changes.
So it really does seem to be pointing towards this specific frequency in this specific region as a core mechanism for keeping that self-boundary intact.
It looks like a key part of the machinery, yes.
Yeah.
And this is where the science starts to hit on a really deep existential level.
How so?
Well, if you connect this recursive model idea and its breakdown to the bigger picture, you find this profound link emerging with how we relate to mortality.
Okay. Tell me more.
Studies on long-term ayahuasca users found that a lifetime history of experiencing ego dissolution actually predicted a greater degree of impermanence acceptance.
Wow. Acceptance of impermanence. That's huge, isn't it? That feels like the ultimate payoff. The same neural switch we flip to kind of lose ourselves momentarily might also be the switch that lets us stop fighting the reality of death so hard.
It's pretty stunning when you think about it. There was another study looking at meditators. Their brains, when showing these neurophysiological markers linked to positive ego dissolution experiences, responded to death-related stimuli in a way that indicated acceptance, not denial or suppression.
So the brain wasn't doing the usual defensive maneuvers?
Exactly. It seems the neural mechanisms that typically shield the self from existential threat, often by, pushing death away, seeing it as something that happens to the other, the non-self. These mechanisms seem quite malleable. They can be altered by this kind of training or experience.
So dissolving the self, even temporarily, might actually dissolve some of the fear that's built around its inevitable end.
That seems to be the implication. Lose the self, lose the core thing that fears extinction.
Okay, that journey from a fragile, recursive self-model all the way to accepting death, that's compelling enough. But here's where the conceptual framework just kind of explodes outwards.
Right, it doesn't stop with human brains.
This whole idea of recursive self-modeling, it's now being applied way beyond human cognition. We're seeing it in artificial intelligence and even fundamental physics.
And what's fascinating is how the challenge of defining selfhood in us translates almost directly into practical solutions for technology, especially making AI we can actually trust.
How does building a self into an AI help a human user? What's the benefit?
Well, it creates introspection and, crucially, explainability. We often talk about AI as a black box. We don't know why it made a certain decision.
Right, which makes it hard to trust, especially for important stuff.
Exactly. So frameworks are being developed, like one called SentiaDiff, that use a dynamic self-model within the AI. This self-model basically provides a transparent reasoning trace. It records the changes in the AI's own cognitive state as it works through a problem. It forces the machine to, in a sense, introspect.
So the self model becomes the log file we can read to understand its thought process.
Precisely. That's how we can interrogate its decision timeline. It's not just making a decision, it's monitoring its own decision-making process, much like, perhaps, our PMC monitors our sense of self.
That parallel is striking, and it even extends to physical things, buildings.
Yeah, that was surprising. We're seeing digital twin self-models being used for intelligent structures. Think of a small-scale smart building.
Digital twin, like a virtual copy.
A dynamic virtual copy, yes. The self-model is encoded in this constantly updated knowledge graph, representing the building's structural health, its energy use, its current state.
So the building can model its own needs and optimize itself.
That's the goal. A building with a rudimentary form of self-awareness, at least regarding its operational state.
From the human brain to a smart building. That's a massive conceptual leap. Okay, let's go even bigger. Theoretical physics.
Right.
The sources touch on models using these same recursive principles to try and define consciousness itself. Not just as, a weird biological accident, but as something potentially fundamental.
This gets pretty abstract. Fast. But you see concepts like the electrodynamic intelligence, or an EDI framework.
EDI, what's the core idea?
It basically proposes that phenomenal interiority, that subjective feeling, the actual what it's like to see red or feel pain.
The hard problem.
The hard problem. It suggests this arises when encoding this recursive looping, this closure in a physical system, reaches a critical electrodynamic threshold capacity. Call it description.
So if a system can't generate enough internal self-processing power, enough looping complexity, it just doesn't have that inner feeling. It lacks interiority.
That's the hypothesis. Subjectivity isn't binary. It emerges when this recursive complexity hits a certain physical threshold. Consciousness isn't magic. Maybe it's a kind of phase transition, like water turning to ice.
Defined by a capacity limit for internal self-processing.
Wow. And then there's perhaps the most abstract idea we came across.
Go on.
The proposal that conscious awareness isn't an emergent property at all. That it might be a fundamental geometric structure of space-time itself.
Wait, consciousness as geometry, like shapes in space-time?
Kind of. The theory suggests subjective awareness is just a specific type of local geometric configuration. It's proposed to be encoded by something called a symmetric rank 2 tensor, the awareness tensor.
So my feeling of being aware right now is just a particular arrangement, a specific geometric pattern in the fabric of reality right here.
In this view, yes. Less like a computer program running on the hardware of the brain, and more like a specific, organized ripple or warp in space-time itself.
If that's even remotely true, our sense of self is literally woven into the geometry of reality.
It's a mind-bending possibility, connecting the deepest subjective experience to the fundamental structure of the cosmos. Hashtag outro.
What an absolutely incredible journey. We started off defining the self as this transparent, dynamic, recursive model.
Almost like a piece of biological software.
Yeah. Then we tracked its unlooping, this ego dissolution, down to specific neural signals, those beta wave reductions in the posterior medial cortex.
A tangible signature for losing oneself.
And then we saw this whole conceptual machine, this idea of recursive self-modeling, being used to design AI that can explain itself.
Creating introspection in machines.
And even potentially redefining consciousness itself within fundamental physics, as geometry.
It really shows the power of the concept.
I think the powerful synthesis, pulling from all these diverse sources, is really this. Selfhood isn't some fixed ontological core being.
No, it's presented much more as a dynamically constructed achievement, something the brain does constantly. And because it's constructed, it can be suspended, it can be reorganized.
Whether that happens through years of meditation or a powerful psychedelic experience, or maybe even one day through sophisticated computation.
Right? The collapse of that recursive identity, that unlooping, it really reveals the incredible plasticity and maybe the essential fragility of what it means moment to moment to be you.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with this final thought to chew on. The findings strongly suggest that the very brain mechanisms we seem to use to deny our own mortality. That deep-seated habit of pushing death away, thinking it only happens to others.
The cognitive shield.
That shield seems to be adjustable. It's amenable to mental training or experiences linked directly to self-dissolution. So if ego dissolution, the temporary loss of self, is potentially a key mechanism for accepting death, for lowering that existential fear, What other deeply ingrained cognitive patterns, what other ways of thinking that we currently believe are just fixed fundamental parts of being human? What else might be unlocked or shifted through non-traditional training or experiences targeting this sense of self?
Yeah.
What fundamental cognitive shifts might become possible that we right now think are completely impossible?
That's a fascinating question to ponder. What else could unlooping unlock?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.